Hey, welcome to the Virtually Speaking podcast. My name is Pete Flecha, and joining me as usual is my good friend, Mr. John Nicholson. John, how you doing, sir?
Good. It's been a minute since I've seen you in person, Pete.
Absolutely, man. And what better time to talk to you? But VCF 9 is just launched, and so yeah, we got to do something in person. And speaking of in person, we are joined today by one of our VCF experts, Mr. William Lam. William, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me in person. It's great to see you guys in the same room now. No more virtual, right?
Yeah. So I guess we're physically speaking instead of virtually speaking.
Exactly.
Now, William, yeah, as we all know, VCF 9 just launched. There's a lot of stuff to cover, so we're going to do an entire series. We're going to walk through from top to bottom. And as we all know, like this release kind of represents kind of a change in the way infrastructure is deployed, managed, and consumed. Lots to get into. And so, William, I would love to just start from the very top. Like, from your perspective, how has VCF 9 changed from previous versions?
Yeah, no, it's a complete re-architecture of our software stack. If you think about where customers are at today, they've got various components, the products are deployed. Very challenging to manage at scale, right? And customers have been asking us for sort of this fleet level concept, right? So how do I manage multiple instances? And for the customers who have transitioned into VMware Cloud Foundation, version 5.x that you understand today, you still have multiple of these VCF instances that you have to manage. That means you have things like the operations platform, various automation platform that customers are using today. And it does make it very difficult to kind of manage that at scale. And so a big change of part of VCF 9 from an architectural standpoint is we want to really not only unify the product components, but also simplify how you manage that specifically at fleet scale. And so what that looks like for a lot of customers is that you still have your core components of the SCDC. This is your compute, your storage, your networking. As we all know, that's your vSphere, your vSAN, and our NXX component. That becomes the building block for our overall VCF fleet, right? So these are the different VCF instances. But what's dramatically changed is now we're actually providing you with this kind of global control plane, management plane, using something called VCF Operations. So we've actually transformed our ARIA Operations, formerly known as ARIA Operations, into this new global control plane. So it's more than just your monitoring, your logging platform, but it really is that central global control plane to manage your entire VCF instance, at scale, right? And introducing net new capabilities, patch, security, lifecycle management, configuration, drift. There's a whole lot of things that we'll kind of go into in a second. And then that becomes sort of the building block in terms of how do you operationalize this at scale, similar to like what you might do in the public cloud, but enabling you to do that, much more simply within your on-prem infrastructure. And then bolting on top of that, now that you've got this, foundational modern infrastructure, we're now able to then overlay that with our new VCF automation platform that can then take all these building blocks using policy, security, compliance, and bubbling that up and making that available, for your end users, and truly have that in a multi-tenanted and a modern experience, right? To developers, to your end users, right, for your workloads.
That's interesting because this reminds me of just a challenge I'd sometimes have. Like vSphere was great, but when I needed different tenancy or I had different environments of like managing between them, it often felt like it was a one-to-one relationship with my ops or my instances or my SSO domains. But this looks like we're looking at the lifecycle in a different way instead of like having these bottom-up lifecycle components, like a top-down, central-driven.
That's right, yeah. And it's really just, again, kind of going back to that fleet level topic that while we say that a lot, we really do mean it. And so we've kind of unified all those places in terms of where you would provide, lifecycle management, configuration, drift, so that you now have one place to do it. And that's something that customers have been asking for time after time. And so even for our existing VCF customers, they're going to see a huge dramatic change in reducing their overall costs, but also just operating model. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're just bringing simplicity to running a modern private cloud, using our VCF 9 software stack.
Yeah, it almost seems like, one app, versus before it was like an aggregation of many apps, if you will, But yeah, having everything deployed, managed, and in a place for people to actually consume it all inside of one interface is, obviously that's been the end goal for a while, but it seems like VCF 9, I think, is probably one of the first real examples of that.
Right, and it's really just pulling, again, those components, the things that we love and know, and just turning that into a real platform, right? Then you can really start to deliver, outcomes for the business, all the technologies that you can take advantage of to run various workloads, both existing workloads, but more importantly, the modern workloads that we're talking about, things like AI workloads, ML workloads, et cetera.
Yeah. And we're going to be talking to Chris Wolf later. We're going to dive deep on VMware Private AI. But for you, William, I would love to just, I'm not going to take your whole day, but I would love to spend a few minutes going through maybe some of those core components that you mentioned, sort of what's new in those as it pertains to VCF 9.
Yeah, so I like to kind of start off, kind of the three-layer click or classical things, like looking at the building blocks, right? We continue to innovate in the core platform. That's our compute, storage, and networking. And there's a whole lot of exciting features I'm sure that other folks will be talking about, and I'm sure a lot of customers will be looking at. But there are a few that really stand out to me. If you think about the compute side, historically we used to talk about these like monster VMs for existing workloads. If you look at the scale of the vSphere platform and specifically our hypervisor, it's truly best in class. And I think now we're getting close to more than 1,000 vCPUs and over 16 terabytes of memory. So it's not even monster VMs. These are like behemoth or Titan VMs.
That's bigger than my data center used to be.
And so typically it's like we've been able to run workloads, all the way to like MS-DOS workload, all the way up to workloads that we have today. But really this new size and scale is really to cater to the next generation of applications that are being built right now. And there's really no other hypervisor in the world that can really manage at the scale and all the different guest operating systems that we support. So I think that's the first one, first Mo. The second capability, I'm really excited. We kind of hinted this at our 8.0U3 release, which was this NVMe or memory tiering capability.
Oh yeah.
So this allows you to basically take NVMe SSDs and basically provide a second tier of memory to the workloads, and this is done transparently. Now, there were some caveats that initially came out with 8.0U3, and I'm really excited to share that all of those capabilities have been fully unlocked in the VCF 9 platform. Not only is the NVMe tiering capability fully GA in VCF 9.0, but we've done a lot to really make it much more flexible for our users. First and foremost, the workloads themselves, you can have both NVMe tiering or basically tiered virtual machines along with workloads that are not tiered. So now you can have
you can pick and choose.
You can pick
who
and
gets
choose
that priority,
right, based on your workloads, right? So that's one change. The other piece of it, we also in the earlier releases, the ESXi hosts within the cluster, we would recommend that all hosts must participate and basically provide NVMe tiering capabilities. That means that you had to have homogeneous clusters. In VCF 9, we will allow you to have a cluster that has different hosts participating in NVMe tiering. And the reason we're doing that is because you have much deeper integration into vSphere DRS. So now we have integration not only looking at the tier 0 memory, basically DRAM, but we also look at tier 1, basically the tiered memory, and start to look at those statistics and start to provide guidance and recommendations in terms of when to move the workloads. So again, really make this enterprise ready for those workloads that have the requirements. And as we all know, we don't typically have one cluster of one type of workloads. We want to make sure that we can bin pack as many workloads as possible to make use of the underlying hardware and using intelligence and policies within our platform to really improvise where the VMs should be basically migrated towards.
Well, and it's been fantastic looking at the tech preview of that feature, just where it's come and talking to people who've been playing with it and saying, look, the impact, as long as you've got workloads, that the memory activity supports it, which is just about everyone, to be honest with you. It's good to see DRS has awareness of that, because I think a lot of people naively assume DRS is like, oh, it just looks at memory allocations and just kind of shuffles the cards and does that. But looking at that level of like memory activity to figure out the different tiers of memory, like shows just how deep that IP goes.
Yeah. So that's a really exciting one, and it's really going to enable a whole class of applications, both existing, and because this is done transparently at the VMM level, right? There's no in-guest awareness, right? You won't even realize
there's no drivers or anything.
Exactly. So the rollout is very simple, and then it's really the benefit of the VCF 9 platform, right? Just by simply upgrading the platform, you inherently get this capability, right? And physical RAM is something that's really hard to basically add in once you've maximized that. And so this is a really awesome, software technique, and we're doing more in this space in the future. But this is one that I'm certainly excited about from a compute standpoint.
When the unit economics keep changing, obviously by the day. But I remember looking at some of the dense DIMMs, and I was looking at $20 a gig on one case, and then I start looking at mixed use NVMe, and I'm looking at maybe 30 cents or less.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that is an orders of magnitude price difference. And you get these hosts that, you go beyond 1 terabyte, you go to 4 terabytes. You go from half to 80% of your hosts being RAM cost now for the hardware. This is some big numbers.
Yeah. And while obviously the focus of this capability is for production grade, mission critical workloads, there's huge benefit for anybody that wants to do experimentation, lab development, CI/CD, being able to pack even more workloads.
Oh yeah, I'm home labbing this feature already because I don't have that much RAM.
Exactly, yeah. So same here, right? And so I think being able to add a host with 64 gigs, 96 gigs of memory, and all of a sudden have that magically turn into a half a terabyte of memory.
Right.
With a very inexpensive NVMe. Of course, we would recommend, high-end NVMe devices, which is going to be the recommendation, but you can see how easy this capability you can just use. Again, it's just upgrading the software.
William, you are the home lab king. I'm wondering, what level of influence did you have with product management on this feature?
I plead the fifth on this one. So it's definitely some really exciting innovations, right? And so, customers don't think that we're still innovating in the platform, there's so much innovation happening, and these are some of the really exciting capabilities that I really talk about.
And it's also, I like you talking about like making sure it plays nice with the other features and actually plays better with them. It's not just, oh, you can tier memory. It's you can do it, but do it without having to make compromises. That's a great news on the platform.
Yeah, and all these metrics, again, is going to get bubble up into the new VCF Operations. So you have that visibility, you're able to see your workloads, and so you can really understand, how's that workload, and you might even be able to see SLAs actually improve over time. And because it's transparently, you can start to roll this out in a small blue-green fashion and actually start to optimize your infrastructure. In some cases,
if I've got a web server farm, send half to that tiering, half not. Watch your SLAs. Ooh, that's fun.
Yeah, so there's going to be a lot of exciting things. So definitely a lot more on the compute side, but these are just some of the ones that I kind of wanted to cherry pick out. Obviously, storage, lots of exciting stuff happening on the storage. vSAN replication is a huge one to be able to take that and now, basically quote unquote back up these, high performance snapshots, right? While snapshots are not backups, they do enable a lot of really fantastic use cases. So I really am excited to see that we have that from a disaster recovery and protection standpoint. But another big one is around just efficiency of the platform, right? Especially our ESA architecture. We now have global vSAN dedupe, which is humongous. I know a lot of our users have been expecting. Now, we've had that capability in earlier releases, but it primarily looked at it per host, single disk group standpoint. Now we're able to extend that technology and look at it holistically across the entire cluster, across multiple hosts. And so now we're able to actually collapse down. And I've heard some of the numbers, they're looking really, really good in terms of, what you're getting back up, up to 30, 40%, depending on, how many disk group configurations you've got, right? So the ESA architecture really lends itself into some of that optimization and using a sort of a 4K block size to look at, what things can we kind of dedupe on the back end.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, the dedupe is available upon request, like technical requests. So it's not generally for every customer, but it's one of those things that we're rolling out initially as
storage, we like to, move cautiously and forward.
Is that like a soft launch?
Yeah. But no, this is something that, we had dedupe with OSA, but there were compromises on it would slow down performance and things like that. And it looks like we've done a good job here. Engineering's done a good job of removing a lot of those compromises of the global and making sure that this isn't, it stays out of the right path and things like that.
Right.
So
yeah, and really a lot of this it's based on the ESA architecture, right? So that's really given us, dividends going forward, right? No longer is it kind of getting destaged, like kind of what John was mentioning, right? And it's doing it more opportunistically, right? And that's kind of what you would expect, right? So as your workloads are kind of churning away, it's going to basically use resources, and the resources have been minimal. So again, that ESA architecture really is the key going forward for our platform, enabling things like global dedupe, vSAN replication, and there's a whole slew of
all the snappy replicates. So
exactly, and then kind of round it off, networking, right? Obviously, we have our NSX capability, but in VCF 9, I feel like we've really made VPC constructs, right? Which is a very common construct that is well understood in the public cloud. But in the on-prem world, we never really had this construct, so we kind of introduced it, but it was still I had to do in NSX Manager, I had to do outside of typically the customers or the admin's management plane, which is typically vCenter, right? Sort of the lifeblood of the infrastructure platform. And what we've done was we made VPCs a first-class citizen within vCenter. And that capability then bubbles up further up the stack where you can start to leverage it from a multi-tenant standpoint. But now you have the way to securely and create self-tenanted access, right, to networking subnets. And we also have this new construct called a transit gateway that just simplifies connectivity for north and southbound, and you're able to delegate that to end users for access, right? So again, based on policies and controls, right, the network administrator and or vSphere administrator can now basically construct these VPCs directly in vCenter, and these are first-class citizen. It's not like, oh, well, here's a shim, and I got to go to NSX Manager, right? So
yeah, not having to go bounce between UIs.
Exactly. And we have a lot of folks who wear multiple hats in terms of managing their infrastructure. It's not just the server administrator, the network and storage. Oftentimes, our users, our private cloud admins, they do everything, right? And so instead of sending them to different interfaces, again, part of VCF 9 is just to unify all these different disparate components, turning it into a real platform, right? And so I feel like the networking piece we kind of rounded that out with VPCs, transit gateways, and really just simplifying that. And again, this becomes the building block that we can then start to push that up further up the stack in terms of how do you expose that access for
a VRA or something else consume that. So.
Exactly. Yeah. So these are just some of the ones that really stand out. But there's just so many features. I'm sure when you read the release notes, there's going to be pages of new capabilities that you're going to be able to turn on, right? And so again, The point here is that the core platform,
Yeah.
we haven't stopped innovating, and this is just a taste of what's to come. There's a lot more that we're still working on.
Absolutely. And at Virtually Speaking, we're going to be going through the various components in a slightly deeper dive, but we really wanted to get your insight on those three. But so for folks that are interested, how do folks transition? Because obviously we know there are folks that are been at VMware for a long time, working maybe various stages of a private cloud, if you will. But how do people actually transition to VCF?
Yeah, so there's like two other components I kind of want to talk about too, right? Is once you've got that foundation, one of the things, like I said, even today for existing VCF customers, you're having to deploy this operation or ARIA, formerly ARIA operations. Now it's VCF operation is really now your new unified control plane. Right? And so now you're able to deploy those infrastructures and you have one place to go for all of your fleet management. Something as simple as single sign-on. While we've talked about it and we had different identity providers like Ping, Okta, ADFS, Entra AD, we're actually broadening out the capabilities. So again, VCF operation becomes that single control plane, and it can be deployed in a multi-regional, multi-site configuration, right? Depending on latency and scale, and ultimately sort of your comfortness. But our plans and goal is to really make that your single console. Similar to if you were to go to the public cloud, you kind of have one console. We're basically delivering that capability, but it's not just for consistent inventory. We have single sign-on. So now you have true sign-on into the entire stack. But to take it further, historically we had limitations of like what providers are external IDPs, something that we've heard time after time. In VCF 9, because we're building on this identity broker concept, we're now able to broaden the support of identity providers. We'll still support the Oktas, the Ping Federates, ADFS, but we're also supporting all the open standards. So basically any SAML2 based identity provider, AD over LDAP, and even just common OAuth, which basically means that in VCF 9, we will support all the different identity providers out there. So things like Keycloak, Authentic, there's so many out there that customers are using today that are like, hey, well, these are following open standards, but they don't work in the existing model. In VCF 9, we're actually bringing that forward and making it actually much more simpler to set up. And you get the benefit, again, single sign-on to the entire stack. So that's kind of one key capability.
Yeah.
There's a whole other set of fleet-level operations that we're supporting. So if you think about like something as basic as patching and upgrading, historically, when you look at the different products, they all have their individual product UIs, different interfaces, and even when you think about an offline repo for customers that have air-gap environments or security compliance requirements or just latency and bandwidth, I need to basically download all the software, host it as a repository. Now you look at all the components, they all have a different structure of that repository. Some support HTTP, some support HTTPS. And so part of 9 is not just unifying these different components, but we've also unified how we deploy, patch, and upgrade. And so now we have this concept of a unified repository that you place all the software binaries in there, and you're able to basically upgrade, lifecycle, patch, get notified, using one single interface, which is again this VCF Operations platform. We also have things like certificate management, password, lifecycle management, configuration.
Unified password policies, not 6 products having 6 different complexity requests.
Yeah. And it's not just being able to go through that lifecycle, right? But you're able to see that. And so from a compliance security standpoint, I can quickly go in and as an auditor and say, here are all the different VCF instances that's managed by this single VCF operations. Here's the current password policy that's been set forth, or here's a certificate policy. And we've taken certificate even a step further. Today when you replace a certificate, it's not a painful thing. Once you've gotten the CSRs and generated certificate, the painful thing is I gotta do a retrust. And the more components I've got, I gotta do retrust. And so engineering took a look at this and say, hey, this is really painful, could we simplify that? So in the core stack, we're actually making certificate replacement non-disruptive, which is humongous.
Wow, no change window.
So there's no change window there. And so what that means is that using policies, I can adhere to your specific security standards. I can adhere to your security standard. You just basically update the system and say, I need to change it every 30 days, or I need to change it every 6 days, and the system automatically takes that desired state and go ahead and implements it, right? And so you're gonna start to see a lot of this unification around all these common tasks that you typically do on a per component level. Right. And even, like I said, even for existing VCF 5.x customers, you have to do this on every single VCF instance today. Whereas by upgrading to VCF 9, you now have a single place to orchestrate that. And so again, you're requiring less effort, more consistency, and you're really operating at cloud scale, right? Basically being an SRE, platform engineer, right? And at the end of the day, we're just giving our admins time back so that they can actually focus on more exciting things, playing with VCF 9, what type of workloads can I actually enable, right? So that's really a little bit about the operations stack, and that's a big change from customers who are using operations today, which is sort of my monitoring log. You'll still get all that goodness, but it's actually doing a lot more. And I think that's really the exciting piece. And ultimately, that's the big change, right? When you think about going from existing VCF customers into sort of this new VCF 9 world.
I mean, a lot of these workflows you're describing, I'm imagining getting that SR and thinking, oh gosh, I'm gonna have to go touch 20 different places. This is gonna take me, I'm gonna have to go schedule with the cab. I'm gonna have to go schedule this. This is like a 2-week process. And it sounds like a lot of this are becoming, very simple operations or no ops in many cases.
Right.
So I like that story. Let's take that time and let's go learn the rest of the stack or learn the other capabilities.
Exactly, yeah. So there's been a lot of that huge effort, right? And it's been eye-opening, right, to kind of see that. It's like, hey, we're unifying these things and here are some optimizations we can kind of fix. Even simple as APIs, one of the things that we haven't had for longest time is like, global permissions. I was just talking to the PM the other day and it's like, hey, we finally have a REST API for managing global permissions within vCenter. Right, and over time, we're going to again turn these into fleet-level capabilities, so you can start to manage it at scale. Right, so now we've got the core platform bubbling up those capabilities. We've got a true global control plane, that supports private cloud scale. How do I then take this and slice and dice it? Now, historically, we did this in 2 different ways. Right, for our enterprise customers, we had something called RE automation. Yep. Right. Used by many of our customers, or basically provide a true self-service mechanism, right? Ultimately simplifying not only the initial provisioning of workloads, but also day 2 operations, so that I don't have to basically go through a ticket and then have some VIM right click into a VM or write some code. We can actually have all that basically up-leveled up in automation. Then the other user base is typically our service providers. Right, and we had a product called vCloud Director, which did fantastic in terms of the multi-tenancy. There were gaps there, but we did have 2 different offers, right, because of these 2 different users. So a big part of VCF automation and VCF 9 is to really unify these 2 customer base together and really pull in the best of both worlds, right? We now have native multi-tenancy built right into VCF 9. So now you can actually granularly taking the components that we talked about, right, the compute, storage, and networking, right? So using things like vSphere namespaces, right, to bubble up and start to provide you the ability to control how much compute resources I'm going to provide to the workloads. I'm going to be using VPCs, we talked about earlier, TGWs, right? And that becomes sort of the foundational building block and turn those into tenanted items. And again, bubbling that up to VCF automation. And then lastly, we've also got some great tenancy capability coming from vSAN, right, around whether it's object or traditional file service, right? So again, that foundational building block becomes something now that you can then carve up, right, using things like projects and namespaces, and then allowing your sort of tenant admins and your consumers to really access the appropriate resources and making sure that all those guardrails are built in. And that's what you expect of a modern private cloud.
Well, namespaces have been interesting for me to kind of grok and grapple and figure out, because there were a lot of things on resource limitations that existed either just within vSphere or within DRS you could do, but storage often was like missing some of that stuff. Right. And seeing like quotas on storage and seeing quotas on snapshots and all that like come into namespace, I'm like, oh, this is all the missing features for the resource group that I've wanted for years are now all here. And you often would try to like work around it, do weird stuff like, oh, we'll give this person this LUN of this size, and you did like bottom up quoting, and this sounds like you've got like a unified top down, can manage all the resources properly for tenancy.
And yeah, rightfully on the storage, but also on the networking side, we never really had a logical construct, and that's why I feel like we've had this VPC that was sort of floating out here with NSX. It's part of the family now. We're able to take this and then bubble that up and slicing and dice it. So we really have true granular way of carving and slicing these pieces, right? And ultimately, these are all the building blocks that you expect. And then you can overlay on that, advanced services, right? Native private AI capabilities, modern workloads, traditional VMs, but I can also start to modernize, Kubernetes, container-based workloads. I can do this in a declarative state. So the nice thing about VCF automation is that it really is a self-service endpoint, right? You can integrate this with like the ServiceNows of the world. You can provide this on top of a self-service portal. We have a lot of customers who basically do their own delegation of authorization, and they say, hey, Pete's in this particular org, he's going to get, the gold set of resources. John's in this particular org, he not as much then. And so you really have that control, right? And then to the customers who want to do automation, whether it's APIs, declarative via Terraform and Ansible, we support all those capabilities, right? So it really is meeting the needs of our enterprise users or service providers, right? And again, using one single platform. So I think a lot of customers are going to really like what they're going to see, and we're only going to continue to evolve this over time, right? So that's a little bit about the automation aspect of it.
Wow, that's a well-rounded story that we've carved out in the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, and then to your point earlier, you're asking like, well, how do customers transition to that, right?
Yeah.
This is a fantastic stack, and I'm sure a lot of people are asking now. Obviously, we have good clear paths, from customers who are upgrading from VCF. We recommend you to kind of get to 5.x before you kind of upgrade to 9, because you're gonna have the most smoothest path. But I'm sure a lot of customers are wondering like, well, I've deployed a portion of what you're calling the VCF stack. Maybe I just have vSphere, maybe I have vSphere in operations. I've got multiple ARIA automation components. How do I bring that together? And one of the things that we've done fundamentally is not just unify this platform that we have talked about, but we also rethought about, what does the day zero look like? So we have this new thing called the VCF installer. It basically replaces what was known as the VCF Cloud Builder appliance for our VCF customers. And it does a couple of things. First and foremost, obviously, it's going to help you deploy the full VCF stack in a very easy, simplified manner, both UI as well as via API and automation. But it also will allow us to also deploy our VVF stack, so our vSphere Foundation stack. So it's a single installer for that. But more importantly, it's really, how do I take your existing infrastructure?
Yeah, because we've already got that installed. So
yeah,
how do
customers
we get
have that installed. You don't need to re-architect. We're actually.
I don't need to go buy a fresh rack of.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, some customers may have that preference because, hey, you know what, the hardware that I'm running on, in some cases, just the version of vSphere, you can probably date the hardware. And they're like, you know what, I want to get off of that. And so we certainly see customers saying, hey, you know what, I'm going to build a brand new greenfield infrastructure, modern hardware, modern networking
no
underlay.
Broadwells. Let's go get all the nice shiny sapphire wrappers.
Exactly,
here,
right?
so.
And then transition from that way. So we definitely have a path forward for you there, and you typically will move the workloads. But in many cases, our customers are going to say, I want to be able to start from my existing topology, my existing products, right? And that was a big requirement as part of VCF 9. It's like, hey, we can easily deploy something brand new. It's much more difficult to work with existing components. And so we spend a lot of time. And so you might hear terminologies like brownfield, import, convert, but it's really being able to take those existing infrastructure, and this is done natively within the VCF installer tool, right? So we're able to basically probe it and say, you've got a vSphere environment. If you don't have operations, we'll go ahead and ask for the information, networking, IPs for that component, and then we go ahead and deploy that for you as part of the overall deployment. Again, depending on what you have, and this includes things like NSX. NSX is something that a lot of our customers had. It's like, I have this here. How do I get that into 9? We're able to reuse those components, get them upgraded, then bring that into what we're now calling this VCF fleet, right? Which is our VCF instance, our core components, and then operations and automation. And we can do that for each of those components. And that's a big part of helping our users transition to 9 as easily as possible without having them to redeploy components that they already have deployed.
No, I remember when I would talk to people about VCF back in the day when it was greenfield only, was the only path. And I'd be like, this is great. We'll look at this in 3 or 4 years when we buy new servers.
Right.
And I was like,
yeah.
But no, I like meeting people where they are here.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's a big part of the installer piece of it, right? And that really helps users transition to it. And there'll be a lot more best practices that the solution architecture team are putting forth, and even some of the best practices. It's not part of the documentation. So while docs is not always the most fun thing to talk about, it itself is also getting revamped. And so a lot of the best practices that typically would be provided as like external collateral elsewhere, we're really putting that in together. And in fact, solutions architecture team is also working with our IX and design team to make sure that all of that is there so that you can follow, documentation and have that streamlined based on your specific deployment model, that they can kind of follow that and have a good experience in deploying VCF 9.
Yeah, most people are still going to go to williamlam.com, but hey, we're going to have some good documentation here as well.
Absolutely.
William, this has been great. We've only had you for a few minutes, but this is a really well-rounded discussion of what's going on with VCF 9 and how people get there. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.